Hey everyone, welcome back to Study Hall. Today we are going deep diving into birthright citizenship in the U.S. And there's this recent executive order that's seeking to kind of redefine it.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic these days, especially considering how central birthright citizenship has been to American identity since the 14th Amendment.
For sure. And, that's what makes this executive order, the one signed on January 20th, 2025. So fascinating and honestly a little bit unsettling. We've got two main sources for deep dives, the text of the executive order itself, and then this analysis that outlines potential pros and cons.
Yes.
Before we get into all that, let me just throw this out there. Have you ever thought about how your life might be different if whether or not you were American?
Yeah.
It was determined by
It was touched.
circumstances of your birth.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild to think about, right?
It really is. I mean, this executive order really makes us question, what we think it means to be American.
Right. Okay, so let's get into this executive order. So it starts off by saying its purpose is, quote, protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. What do you make of that? What values do you think of when you think about what it means to be an American citizen?
Well, I think a lot of people will probably say American citizenship. It brings to mind ideals like freedom, opportunity, equality before the law. It's about being part of a society that, at least in theory, tries to uphold those values.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But this executive order seems to imply that those values are being threatened somehow by how we currently understand birthright citizenship. It then goes on to lay out two very specific cases where birthright citizenship wouldn't apply anymore.
Yeah. So the first one is children born to mothers who are in the U.S. illegally when the father isn't, a citizen or a permanent resident. And then the second scenario applies to children born to mothers who are here legally, but just temporarily, like on a visa or something. And again, the father's not a citizen or permanent resident.
So essentially, you could have a kid who's born in the U.S., but they wouldn't be considered American, even if they grow up here and see this as their home. It is interesting, though, that the order makes it clear that this doesn't affect children of lawful permanent residents. So it seems like they're trying to draw a very fine line here.
Yeah, and that's where things start to get really messy, both from a legal and ethical standpoint. The order also mandates all these documentation requirements, agency compliance, and public guidance to be issued within 30 days, which raises a whole bunch of logistical questions. But I think we should probably shift gears now and look at that analysis we talked about before, the one that breaks down some of the potential pros and cons of this policy change.
Okay, let's do it. So let's start with the arguments for the order. What does the analysis point to as potential benefits?
Well, one of the main arguments is that making the rules for birthright citizenship stricter actually makes citizenship more valuable, because then it's more closely tied to legal status and to a real connection with the country. The analysis actually says, quote, by narrowing the criteria for birthright citizenship, the policy aligns with the perspective that U.S. citizenship is a privilege tied to legal and substantial ties to the country.
So they're basically saying that citizenship should be earned, not just automatically given to you because you happen to be born here. It makes you wonder, though, what they really mean by, quote, substantial ties. What about someone who's born here, grows up here, contributes to society here, but their parents weren't here legally? Would they be considered to have substantial ties?
Those are exactly the kinds of questions that are going to be debated in the months and years to come. The analysis also says that the order could help stop birth tourism, which is where people come to the U.S. just to have kids, who will then automatically become citizens.
That's a fair point, though it does make me wonder how common that actually is. The analysis doesn't really give any numbers on that.
That's true. It also suggests that the order could lead to clearer and more consistent application of citizenship laws, so basically less ambiguity, and a more streamlined process. It says that, quote, by providing clear guidelines, the order aims to streamline the interpretation and application of citizenship laws, reducing ambiguities.
So it's all about making things clear and consistent. But couldn't you also argue that this order actually creates more confusion and maybe even discrimination? Like, who gets to decide what counts as a substantial tie to the country?
That's a valid concern for sure. And that kind of leads us to the last argument in favor of the order, which is that putting more emphasis on whether the parents are here legally is in line with broader national policies on immigration enforcement. And it could potentially ease the strain on public resources.
So basically, it's part of a bigger push to tighten immigration controls. Okay, so we've talked about the potential benefits, at least according to this analysis. Now let's look at the other side. What are some of the big concerns that the analysis raises about this order?
Well, maybe the biggest concern is that it might not even be constitutional. People who are against the order say that it goes against the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship and that it's going to face a ton of legal challenges. The analysis puts it like this. Quote, critics may argue that the order conflicts with the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship.
That's a huge deal. It seems like they're trying to go around Congress and basically reinterpret the Constitution through an executive order. That's a pretty bold move.
It is. And the analysis also talks about the very real risk of creating statelessness or leaving kids in legal limbo, even though they were born in the U.S., but then denied citizenship because this order. Imagine being born in a country, but not actually belonging to it. The analysis states, quote, children born to non-citizen or temporary status parents may face statelessness or legal uncertainty even if they grow up in the U.S., leading to social and economic challenges.
It's a really sad thought. We're talking about kids who might grow up here, go to school here, speak English, think of themselves as American, but legally they're not.
Exactly. And that legal uncertainty could affect every part of their lives, from getting an education and healthcare to finding a job later on. There's also the practical question of how this is all going to be put into practice, the analysis points out. That verifying the parent's immigration status at birth could create a lot of administrative burdens, delays, and costs. Hospitals and healthcare providers will probably need to come up with new procedures, and there's a good chance that there will be errors and inconsistencies.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare waiting to happen. And beyond all that, the analysis also worries about the possibility of creating even more division within families that already have mixed immigration statuses, where some members are U.S. citizens and others aren't. This could cause a lot of tension and hardship within families. The analysis says, quote, the policy could create divisions within mixed status families, where some members have U.S. citizenship while others are excluded, impacting social cohesion.
Right. And then there's the international angle, too. There's a chance this could have negative diplomatic consequences, especially with countries that have close ties with the U.S. This order could strain relationships and make it harder to cooperate on things like trade and immigration.
So it's clear that this executive order has really broad implications that go way beyond just the legal definition of citizenship. It touches on fundamental questions about identity, belonging, and what it means to be American in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And it raises important questions about the balance between national security and individual rights, and about the role of government in shaping the future of American society.
You know, as we're digging into this executive order and thinking about all the potential fallout, the 14th Amendment keeps coming up. It seems like everything hinges on how that amendment is interpreted, especially that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. It feels like that's really open to debate.
Yeah, it's a key point. And to really get what's at stake here, we need to look at the historical context of the 14th Amendment. It was ratified in 1868, right after the Civil War. And its main goal was to give citizenship to formerly enslaved African Americans.
Right. It was meant to overturn that Dred Scott Supreme Court decision,
right,
which had said that black people couldn't be citizens.
Yeah.
Just reminds you how messed up our legal system has been in the past.
Absolutely. And so when the 14th Amendment talks about people being subject to the jurisdiction thereof, the general understanding was that it didn't include Native Americans, because at the time they were seen as members of separate sovereign nations.
But over time, the way we understand that phrase has broadened a lot, hasn't it?
It has. It's come to include pretty much everyone born on U.S. soil, regardless of their parents' immigration status. It's the idea of just solely right of the soil, which has been like a foundation of American citizenship for generations.
And now this executive order is directly challenging that understanding.
And exactly. And that's why legal experts think there are going to be a bunch of lawsuits, people against the order say, that it's a clear attempt to get around the 14th Amendment without going through the proper channels, like congressional action or a Supreme Court ruling.
It really raises the question of the balance of power between the different branches of government. What do you think? Could this executive order actually hold up in court?
That's the big question, isn't it? There's no simple answer. The Supreme Court has never actually ruled on whether the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship applies to children born to undocumented immigrants. So this case could very well end up in front of the Supreme Court, and their decision would have huge implications for the future of American citizenship.
This is a lot to take in. Let's say, for argument's sake, that this executive order does go into effect as planned 30 days after it was signed. What would that actually mean for families and individuals?
Well, One of the most immediate and concerning impacts would be the increased anxiety and fear among parents who are expecting a child, especially those who are undocumented or on temporary visas. They're now facing the possibility that their children, even if they're born in the U.S., might not be recognized as American citizens. It's this whole new level of uncertainty and a vulnerability that a lot of families never had to worry about before.
I can't imagine the stress and worry that would cause. And it also makes me think about the practical challenges for hospitals and healthcare providers. They're going to need to come up with new ways to verify the immigration status of parents when a child is born.
You're right. It's not just about legal principles. It's about the practical realities on the ground. And those realities can have very real consequences for people.
Absolutely. Can you give us an idea of what this might look like for a child who's born in the U.S. but denied citizenship because of this order?
Imagine a child growing up in the United States, going to American schools, speaking English, embracing American culture. But because of their parents' immigration status, they're not considered American. They could run into a lot of problems trying to get into college, accessing health care, even finding a job. They could be denied a driver's license, the right to vote, even the ability to travel freely. They basically be living in a constant state of legal limbo, always facing the possibility of being deported to a country they might hardly even know.
It's a pretty grim picture. It seems to contradict the whole idea of America as a land of opportunity, the nation built by immigrants. This executive order feels like a big departure from that historical narrative.
It does, doesn't it? And it's important to realize that this isn't just an American issue. This reflects a larger global trend of countries trying to figure out the complexities of immigration, citizenship, and identity in a world that's becoming more and more interconnected.
It makes you wonder, what's behind this shift? Is it really just about national security and border control? Or are there deeper social and political forces at play?
That's definitely a question worth exploring further, and it's important for us as informed citizens to be aware of the historical and global context surrounding these debates, to understand the different perspectives and motivations involved.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much more to unpack. When we come back, we're going to widen our lens a bit and look at how other countries around the world handle this whole question of birthright citizenship. What are some of the different models out there? And what can we learn from their experiences? Stay tuned, because this conversation is far from over.
Welcome back to Study Hall, everyone. So we were talking about how other countries around the world deal with this whole birthright citizenship issue. It's easy to get focused on just the U.S., but this is really a global thing with a pretty interesting history.
Yeah, you're right. The U.S. is often seen as like the classic example of birthright citizenship, but we're actually kind of in the minority when you look at how many countries grant citizenship just because you're born within their borders.
Who else was part of this, quote, birthright citizenship club, so to speak?
Most countries in the Americas, like Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they still follow this principle. It's mostly a leftover from European colonialism and this idea of claiming a territory. And all the people in it makes sense when you put it that way. But what about other parts of the world? How do they handle citizenship?
A lot of countries. In Europe, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, they go by the principle of jus sanguinis, which means right of blood. So basically, citizenship is mainly determined by the nationality of your parents, or at least one of them, no matter where you're born.
So like if you're born in France, for French parents, you're automatically French, even if you were born while they were on vacation in Germany.
Thailand or something.
Exactly. And there are often these like interesting twists and exceptions. Within those broader frameworks, some countries have this hybrid system where they combine elements of both jus soli and jus sanguinis. So for example, in some places, a child born to foreign parents can still become a citizen if they live in the country for a certain amount of time, or meet some other specific requirements.
So it seems like there's no one right answer. When it comes to citizenship, each country has its own unique situation and priorities. Yeah, exactly. And that highlights the fact that citizenship isn't just a legal status, it's also a social construct. It reflects a nation's history, values, and what it wants to be.
So bring it back to the U.S. and this executive order. What does this tell us about how the idea of American identity is changing in the 21st century?
Well, I think it shows this growing tension between two competing visions of what it means to be American. On the one hand, you have the traditional idea of America as a melting pot, a nation of immigrants, where anyone, no matter their background, can come and make a better life. for themselves and their families.
That's the image that's often portrayed to the rest of the world, isn't it? The land of opportunity,
Right.
where everyone has a chance to succeed.
Right, but then on the other hand, there's this growing sense of anxiety among some people about how fast globalization is happening, immigration, demographic change. There's this fear that American culture and values are being diluted and that the country is losing its sense of unity and identity.
So this executive order could be seen as trying to regain control over what gets to be considered American, to draw a line between us and them.
Yeah, and it brings up these fundamental questions about inclusivity versus exclusivity, welcoming newcomers versus protecting national interests.
It's the debate that's probably going to go on for years to come, not just in the U.S., but all over the world.
Definitely. As globalization keeps intensifying and migration patterns change, more and more countries are wrestling with these same questions about citizenship, identity, and belonging.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've learned a lot about how complicated birthright citizenship is, both here in the U.S. and globally.
It's been great talking about this with you. I hope our listeners have also gained a deeper understanding of this really complex issue.
I'm sure they have. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. One last thing to think about. Beyond all the legal arguments and political debates, what does this executive order really say about the heart of America? What does it mean to be American in a world that's increasingly interconnected and diverse? These are the questions that will shape the future of our country. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into birthright citizenship in America. All right, welcome back to Study Hall, everybody. So, as promised, we're going to zoom out a bit now. Take a look at how other countries around the world handle this whole birthright citizenship thing. You know, it's easy to get caught up in just the American context, but this is actually a global issue with a pretty long and fascinating history.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We tend to think of the United States as like the prime example of birthright citizenship. But in reality, we're actually in the minority when it comes to countries that grant citizenship solely based on being born within their borders.
So who else is in this, birthright citizenship club, so to speak?
Well, most of the countries in the Americas, like Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they still follow this principle. It's largely a legacy of European colonialism and this idea of claiming dominion over a territory and all of its inhabitants.
Yeah, that makes sense when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
But what about other parts of the world? How do they approach citizenship?
Well, a lot of countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, Oceania, they follow the principle of jus sanguinis, which means right of blood. Basically, citizenship is determined primarily by the nationality of one or both parents, regardless of where the child is born.
So, for instance, if you're born in France to French parents, you're automatically French?
Yeah.
Even if you were born while they were on vacation, like in Thailand?
Exactly. And there are often interesting variations and exceptions in these broader frameworks. For example, some countries have what's called a hybrid system, combining elements of both jus sali and jus sanguinis. So in some cases, a child born to foreign parents can acquire citizenship if they reside in the country for a certain period of time or meet certain other requirements.
So it sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to citizenship. Every country has its own unique circumstances and priorities.
Precisely. And it really highlights the fact that citizenship isn't just
A legal status. It's also a social construct. It reflects a nation's history, its values, and its aspirations. So if we bring it back to the U.S. then, and this executive order, what does this tell us about how the idea of American identity is evolving in the 21st century?
Well, I think it reflects this growing tension between two competing visions of what it means to be American. On the one hand, you have this traditional ideal of America as a melting pot, a nation of immigrants, where anyone, regardless of their background, can come and build a better life for themselves and their children.
Right. That's the image that's often projected to the rest of the world, right? The land of opportunity.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, you have this growing anxiety among some segments of society about things like the rapid pace of globalization, immigration, demographic change. There's this fear that American culture and values are being diluted and that the country is losing its sense of national unity and identity.
So you could see this executive order as an attempt to kind of reassert control over who gets to be considered American, to draw a clearer line between us and them.
Yeah, and it really raises these fundamental questions about the balance between inclusivity and exclusivity, between welcoming newcomers and protecting national interests.
It's a debate that's likely to continue, for years to come. And not just in the United States, but all around the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As globalization intensifies and as migration patterns shift, more and more countries are going to be grappling with these same fundamental questions about citizenship, identity, and belonging.
This has been a really insightful deep dive, I think. I feel like I've learned a lot about the nuances of birthright citizenship, both here in the U.S. and in a global context.
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you. I hope our listeners have also gained a deeper understanding of this really complex issue.
I'm sure they have. And as we wrap up here, I want to leave you with this one final thought to kind of ponder. Beyond the legal arguments and the political debates, what does this executive order tell us about the soul of America? What does it mean to be American in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected and diverse? These are the questions that are going to shape the future of our nation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into birthright citizenship in America.